60 years had passed since humanity first heard the voice of the stars, and in all that time, they had never once been allowed to speak back as equals. It began with celebration, the day the Galaxy cruiser appeared above the skies of Geneva, and broadcast a message of peace in 14 human languages. The entire world had wept with joy, because they believed they were no longer alone, because they believed the universe had opened its arms and welcomed them home. They were wrong. The Galactic Council was old, older than most of the stars humanity had named in its short history, and it governed more than 4,000 spacefaring civilizations from a massive structure called the Accord Spire, a station so large it bent light around itself, orbiting a dead neutron star called Valcor Prime, and within its vast halls, the fates of entire species were decided with the raise of a hand or the flicker of a tentacle. When humanity arrived at the spire, for the first time, full of wonder and desperate to belong, the council had already made its decision. They looked at humanity and they saw fire, not the gentle kind that warms a home, but the wild kind that eats forests and turns mountains to ash, and so they created a special name for what humans were. They called them a Tier 9 Feral Ascendant Species, a label that had only been used twice before in the Council's long history, and both of those species had been wiped out before they could become a threat. Humanity would not be wiped out. The Council was not that crude, but it would be contained. The containment accords were signed under pressure and dressed up as diplomacy, and they stripped humanity of almost everything that mattered. Humans were allowed only 14 star systems, no more, and their fleet could never exceed 300 warships, and they were banned from building artificial intelligence above a certain level, and they were denied voting seats on any major council committee, and every 10 years they had to submit to an inspection to make sure they had not broken the rules. It was a leash, plain and simple, wrapped in silk and called a treaty. And for 60 years, humanity wore it, not because they were weak, never because they were weak, but because they believed, truly and deeply, that if they were patient enough and good enough, the galaxy would eventually see them for what they really were. Admiral Rena Achilles stood on the bridge of the HSS Meridian and stared out at the stars through the wide observation window, her hands clasped behind her back, and her jaw tight with the kind of anger that does not shout, but instead sits in the chest like a stone. She was 53 years old, born on the colony world of New Carthage, raised in a military family that had served Earth since before the stars were reachable, and she had spent her entire career navigating the slow humiliation of being human in a galaxy that treated her kind like dangerous animals on a short chain. Behind her, her senior officers waited in silence, because they knew that look on her face, and they knew what it meant. "The vote came through an hour ago," she said, and her voice was calm the way deep water is calm, still on the surface, but full of currents underneath that could pull you down and never let go. Commander Elias Brandt, her second-in-command, shifted in his seat, but said nothing. "The Council has approved a new amendment to the Containment Accords," Achilles continued, turning to face them at last, and the light from the observation window cast half her face in shadow and half in starlight. "3 of our colony worlds, New Thessaly, Aurelia, and Kessler's Reach, are to be surrendered to the Drythaki hegemony as reparations for a border skirmish that the Drythaki themselves started 6 months ago." The silence in the room turned into something heavier, something with teeth. "The vote was 3,811 in favor," Achilles said, 12 against, and those 12 were species so small the Council doesn't even bother to learn their names. Brandt finally spoke, his voice rough. "New Thessaly has 1.2 billion people on it. Families, children, universities, hospitals. They can't seriously expect us to just hand it over." "They don't expect anything from us, Commander," Achilles replied, and there was something in her eyes that was not sadness and not rage, but something older and more dangerous than both. They gave us a cage and called it a seat at the table, and now they're surprised that we've been sitting in it quietly for 60 years without biting anyone. So they've decided to take a little more, because that's what happens when you mistake patience for surrender. On the Accord Spire, far from human space, a Valaxi diplomat named Counselor Thaven Rowe walked the long curved corridors with his four-fingered hands trembling at his sides. He had voted against the amendment. He always voted against measures targeting humanity. And he had stood before the assembly and warned them, begged them, practically screamed at them, in the calm, measured way his species expressed desperation. "You do not understand what you are doing," he had told the council, his tall frame rigid and his silver eyes wide with something close to fear. "I have studied the humans for 40 years. I have walked their streets, eaten their food, read their histories, and I am telling you, every single one of you, that this species is not what you think it is." The council had listened politely, the way one listens to a child telling a story about a monster under the bed, with patience and without belief. "They are patient because they choose to be," Thaven had continued, his voice cracking, "not because they have to be. And there is a difference, a terrible and important difference. And if you keep pushing them, if you keep taking from them, if you keep treating them like animals, one day you will push too far, and on that day you will learn what the humans have been holding back, and I promise you, it will be the last lesson this council ever learns." They had thanked him for his passion and moved on to the next agenda item. Now, walking alone through the spire's corridors, Thaven stopped before a window that looked out into the endless dark of space, and somewhere out there, 14 little star systems sat quietly in the black, and inside them, 8 billion humans were about to receive the news that their worlds had been sold from under them by species that had never bothered to learn their names. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and closed his eyes. "What have we done?" he whispered, and the stars outside offered no answer, because the stars had never been the ones to worry about. It was the silence between them, dark and the deep and the waiting, where something vast and furious and patient had been growing for 60 long years, and it was almost ready to open its eyes. New Thessaly was beautiful in the way that only a world built by desperate hands can be beautiful. Every tree had been planted on purpose. Every river had been guided into its path. Every mountain had been left standing because someone had looked at it and decided it deserved to stay. 1.2 billion humans called it home, and they had turned a barren rock into a paradise in less than 40 years, because that is what humans do when you give them dirt and time and a reason to care. They built schools where children learned to read under open skies, hospitals where doctors healed wounds both old and new, libraries filled with the collected memory of a species that had never once stopped telling stories, even when the universe told them to be quiet. And in the evenings, families would sit on porches and watch the twin moons rise over fields of golden wheat that stretched to the horizon like a promise. It was everything humanity had ever wanted. A home among the stars. Stars, built with their own hands, earned with their own sweat, and loved with their own hearts. And the galaxy decided to take it away. Secretary General Dominic Fell stood before the cameras on Earth and delivered humanity's response to the Council's demand, and his voice was steady, and his eyes were clear, and his words were simple. "We will not relocate our children to satisfy the hunger of those who have never had to earn what they take," he said, and behind him, the flags of every human colony hung motionless in the still air. New Thessaly is not a bargaining chip. It is a home, and we do not abandon our homes. The Galactic Council had expected this, or at least they had prepared for it, because within 72 hours of Fell's address, a formal peacekeeping resolution was passed, authorizing 3 allied species to seize New Thessaly by force. The Drythaki hegemony, with their massive warships built for brutality. The Krev Collective, with their insectoid swarm fleets that moved like clouds of razors. And the Shovari Dominion with their crystalline vessels that could absorb and redirect energy weapons. 9,000 ships, 9,000, dropped out of faster-than-light travel above New Thessaly on a Tuesday morning, while the children were walking to school. Humanity's garrison fleet was 40 ships. 40 brave, doomed ships, crewed by men and women who knew they could not win, but who lined up anyway, because someone had to stand between the fire and the people behind them. And they fought the way cornered wolves fight, with everything they had and nothing held back. It lasted 3 hours. The garrison fleet was torn apart, scattered across the orbital space like broken glass. And the last human ship, a frigate called the Defiance, rammed itself into the side of a Drythaki dreadnought before it died, carving a wound in the enemy's hull that burned for hours like a scar that would never heal. There was nothing between New Thessaly and the armada above it. Warlord Gorath Vel sat in his command throne aboard the flagship Ironmaw and looked down at the planet below him, and he felt nothing, not guilt, not hesitation, not mercy. Because in the Drythaki way of thinking, the weak existed to serve the strong, and humanity had just proven itself weak. They refused to surrender, his communications officer reported. Gorath Vel leaned forward, his massive armor frame creaking, and his yellow eyes narrowed. Then show them what refusal costs, he said. Target the largest civilian district, and fire. The orbital bombardment hit the city of Elysium Bay at midday. The first blast vaporized the city center, the park where children played, the market where families shopped, the old clock tower that had been built by the first colonists as a symbol of hope. All of it gone in a flash of light, so bright that it was visible from the other side of the planet. The second blast hit the refugee columns. Hundreds of thousands of people running for the shield bunkers, carrying their children, dragging the elderly, screaming and crying and praying to whatever gods they believed in. And the fire came down on them like the hand of something ancient and cruel. The third and fourth and fifth blasts hit hospitals and shelters and schools, because Gorath Vel wanted to make a point. And his point was written in ash and bone. 17 million people died in 6 hours. 17 million names, 17 million faces, 17 million stories that would never be finished. Mothers who died shielding children who died moments later. Fathers who ran toward the fire instead of away from it. Doctors who kept working until the ceiling came down. Teachers who held their students close and whispered that everything would be all right, even though nothing would ever be all right again. The images reached Earth within the hour. Footage captured by surviving colonists, shaky and terrible and real, showing the fires and the craters and the silence where a city used to be, showing a child's shoe sitting alone on a road that led to nowhere, showing an old man kneeling in the ash with his arms around nothing because the person he had been holding was gone. The galaxy saw those images too, and some species looked away in shame, and some species shrugged because it was not their world and not their children, and the Council issued a formal statement expressing regret at the loss of civilian life, while quietly confirming that the peacekeeping resolution remained in effect. They expected humanity to break. They expected desperate calls for a ceasefire, tearful pleas for mercy, frantic negotiations where humans would give up everything they had just to make the dying stop. Instead, something happened that no species in the galaxy had ever seen before. Humanity went silent. Communication channels shut down. Every embassy, every trade frequency, every diplomatic line, every public broadcast, all of it, gone. Like someone had reached into the dark and pulled the plug on an entire civilization. The comm networks that had carried human voices for 60 years now carried nothing but static. And the silence was so sudden and so complete that it sent a chill for every species that noticed it. No demands, no threats, no tears, no rage, just silence, vast and deep and absolute. The kind of silence that comes before something terrible. The kind of silence that makes the hairs stand up on the back of your neck, even if you do not have hair or a neck. On the Accord Spire, Counselor Thavin Rowe stood before the great star map in the Council's war room and stared at the 14 human systems, and every single one of them was dark. No signals, no movement, no light, like watching a row of eyes slowly close. His aide, a young Valaxi with trembling hands, stood beside him and whispered, "What does it mean?" Thavin Rowe did not blink, did not move, did not breathe for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely louder than the hum of the station's engines. "It means they are not grieving," he said, and the words fell into the room like stones into deep water. "It means they are not surrendering, and they are not negotiating, and they are not afraid." He turned from the map and looked at his aide with eyes that held something older than fear. "You fools," he whispered, and it was not clear whether he was speaking to the Council, or to the galaxy, or to fate itself. "You have just killed the leash." The stars outside continued to burn, cold and ancient and indifferent, and somewhere in the dark between them, in the spaces where no one had thought to look, something was waking up. Something that had been patient for 60 years. Something that had endured every insult, and every chain, and every humiliation, with a quiet grace that the galaxy had mistaken for weakness. And now it was opening its eyes. On the 43rd day of silence, diplomats congratulated each other over expensive drinks, and told themselves that the human problem had solved itself. Clearly the bombardment had broken their spirit. Clearly they were collapsing inward, falling apart the way primitive civilizations always do when confronted with real power. And soon they would come crawling back with their heads low and their hands open, begging for whatever scraps the Council was willing to throw them. The Drythaki hegemony was already dividing up the spoils, drawing new borders, assigning new territories, and Warlord Gorath Vel had been promoted to Supreme Commander for his decisive handling of New Thessaly. Life in the galaxy went on, and humanity was forgotten the way you forget a fire after the smoke clears, quickly and completely, and without the slightest understanding that the embers were still burning underground. Then, on the 43rd day of silence, at exactly midnight by Earth's clock, communication system in the galaxy received the same transmission at the same moment. It came on every frequency, in every known language, broadcast with such power that it overrode emergency channels and military encryptions, and even the Council's own secure networks. And the voice that spoke was calm and clear, and carried the weight of 8 billion souls who had spent 6 weeks turning their grief into something the universe had never seen before. To the Galactic Council and all its signatories, you were warned, you were begged, you were given every chance to treat us as equals, and instead you burned our children and called it law. Hear us now, the age of restraint is over. We are coming, not for conquest, not for territory, but for justice, and you will not recognize it when it arrives. The message played once, and then the channels went silent again, and for a long, terrible moment, 4,000 civilizations held their breath. And then the sky broke. They came from the dark spaces between stars, from the voids where no one had mapped, from the black and the cold and the nothing, where humanity had been building in secret for 60 years. And what they had built was beyond anything the galaxy had imagined possible. 12,000 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel across 200 systems simultaneously, and the shock wave of their arrival rippled through the galaxy's sensor networks like a scream. This was Project Prometheus, humanity's hidden answer to the containment accords, built in the deepest dark where no inspection team had ever thought to look. Funded by resources that the Council's auditors had never been clever enough to find. crewed by men and women who had trained in silence and secrecy for decades, each one of them carrying the knowledge that one day the leash would break and they would need to be ready. The ships themselves were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not elegant, not beautiful, not built for show. They were built for war the way a hammer is built for nails, functional and heavy and terrible, with hulls as black as the void they had hidden in, and weapons that glowed with a cold blue light that made seasoned alien admirals feel something they had never felt before. Genuine, absolute, paralyzing fear. And then there were the Furies. The Council had banned humanity from building advanced artificial intelligence, and humanity had nodded and smiled and agreed, and then gone ahead and built them anyway. 7 tactical AI systems, each one capable of coordinating a 1,000-ship battle group with a speed and precision that made organic commanders look like children playing with toys. The Furies did not feel anger, did not feel hate, did not feel mercy. They simply calculated the most efficient path to victory and walked it without hesitation. And they were given names from human mythology that the galaxy would learn to whisper in fear. Nemesis, Alecto, Mega-Era, Tisiphone, Erinyes, Moros, and Ate. And finally there were the weapons, the things humanity had built and hoped to never use. The extinction-class systems that could crack a planet like an egg, or dampen a star until it flickered and died, or bend gravity itself into a blade that could cut a fleet in half. Weapons so powerful that the humans who designed them had wept while building them, because they understood what it meant to hold that kind of fire in your hands. The War of Reckoning began at midnight, and the galaxy learned a new kind of fear. The first strike hit the Drythaki hegemony, because justice demanded it. 3,000 human warships appeared above the Drythaki home systems, and the Fury called Nemesis took command, and the battle lasted 47 minutes. 47 minutes to destroy a fleet that had taken centuries to build. The Drythaki fought hard, because they were warriors, and they did not know how to do anything else. But they were fighting something they had never encountered. An enemy that was faster and smarter, and more coordinated than anything they had ever faced. An enemy whose ships moved like a single organism, whose weapons fired with impossible accuracy, whose tactics shifted and adapted in real time, as if the entire fleet shared one mind. Because it did. Nemesis saw everything, knew everything, predicted everything, and the Drythaki fleet was taken apart piece by piece, with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor. Human Marines boarded the Drythaki command stations, and the fighting in the corridors was brutal and close and personal. And the humans fought with a fury that became legendary. Not wild, not savage, not out of control, but precise and relentless and utterly without mercy for anyone holding a weapon. The Krev Collective was next. Their insectoid swarm fleets had always been their greatest strength, moving in coordinated clouds that overwhelmed enemies through sheer numbers. But the Fury called Alecto had spent years studying their patterns, and she turned their swarms into kill boxes, predicting their movements before they made them, and herding them into crossfires that lit up entire star systems. The Shovari Dominion lasted the shortest. A single human dreadnought, the HSS Prometheus, dropped into orbit above their capital world, and it was so large that it cast a shadow across the surface that could be seen from the ground, and it broadcast a single message on every frequency. You have 12 hours to disarm. There will not be a 13th. The Shovari surrendered in 6. And through all of it, through every battle and every boarding action and every system conquered, humanity did something that stunned the galaxy into a silence deeper than the one they had kept for 6 weeks. They did not touch a single civilian. Not one alien city was touched, bombarded. Not one school was struck, not one hospital was targeted, Not one refugee ship was fired upon. Human warships actively protected alien civilian transports, escorted medical vessels through active war zones, and established safe corridors for non-combatants to evacuate. Prisoners were treated with dignity, wounded enemies were given medical care, and when a Drythaki soldier surrendered, the human marine who accepted his weapon looked him in the eye and said, "You will be returned to your family when this is over." The contrast with New Thessaly was not an accident. It was a message, carved in fire and mercy, written so loudly that even the deafest ears in the galaxy could hear it. Admiral Rena Achilles stood on the bridge of the HSS Retribution, the flagship of the human fleet, and she watched the stars burn with the light of a war that would reshape the galaxy, and her face was calm, and her hands were steady, and her heart was a furnace that she kept carefully banked. Her communications officer turned to her and said, "Admiral, the Drythaki Supreme Command has fallen. Warlord Gorath Vel has been captured alive." Achilles nodded once. "And the civilian sectors?" she asked. "Untouched, Admiral. All civilian protection protocols are holding across every theater." She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were bright with something that was not triumph and not grief, but something fiercer and more human than either. "Good," she said, and then she opened a channel that would broadcast to every ship in the fleet and every listening ear in the galaxy. "This is Admiral Achilles of the human combined fleet. To every species watching, to every world that burned our children, and to every world that stood by and watched. We could burn your worlds the way you burned ours. We have the power, we have the weapons, and we have every right. But we choose not to, and I want you to remember that. Remember it when you write the history of who we are, because this is the difference between us and you. You had the power to show mercy, and you chose slaughter. And we had the power to return the favor, and we chose to be better." The transmission ended, and across the galaxy, 4,000 civilizations sat in the dark and tried to understand what they were witnessing. A species that had been caged and burned and broken, rising from the ashes, not as monsters, but as something far more terrifying, something that was furious and merciful at the same time. The Accord's spire had stood for 12,000 years as the symbol of galactic order, a monument to the idea that civilization could be governed by reason and law. And in all that time, no hostile fleet had ever come within 100 light-years of its ancient halls. Now, 300 human warships hung in the space around it like wolves circling a campfire, their black hulls absorbing the light of the neutron star below, their weapons powered but silent, their engines humming with a patient and terrible energy that made the station's walls vibrate in frequencies that the alien delegates could feel in their bones. They had not fired a single shot at the spire. They simply arrived and took position and waited, and somehow that was worse than any bombardment, because it meant that what was coming next was not destruction, but something far more difficult to survive. It was judgment. Inside the council chambers, chaos had replaced order. Lasted millennia, shattered in hours, as species scrambled to distance themselves from the Drythaki, from the Krev, from the Shovari, from anyone and anything connected to the massacre of New Thessaly. Ambassadors who had voted for the containment accords now claimed they had been coerced. Delegates who had cheered the peacekeeping resolution now swore they had always opposed it. And the great chamber that had once hummed with the confident voices of 4,000 civilizations was now filled with the desperate sound of cowards trying to rewrite their own history before the humans arrived to read it back to them. And then the doors opened. Secretary-General Dominic Fell walked into the Galactic Council chamber the way a man walks into a cathedral, slowly, deliberately, with the weight of something sacred on his shoulders. He was not a large man, not a warrior, Not someone who commanded attention through size or strength. He was 61 years old, with gray at his temples and lines on his face that had been carved there by grief and responsibility. And he wore a simple dark suit, with no medals, no decorations, no symbols of rank, except a small pin on his lapel, in the shape of a flame. The memorial symbol of New Thessaly. Behind him walked Admiral Rena Achilles in her full dress uniform, her back straight and her eyes forward, and her face as unreadable as stone. And behind her walked 12 human officers, who represented the combined military might of a species that had just torn through 3 galactic powers in less than a day. They walked down the long central aisle of the chamber, past rows of alien delegates who fell silent as they passed species that towered over them and species that shrank away from them, past eyes that held fear and eyes that held shame and eyes that held something that might have been the beginning of respect. Fell reached the central podium, the great speaking platform at the heart of the chamber, the place where the fates of civilizations were declared, the place where no human had ever been allowed to stand. And he climbed the steps without hesitation, and stood at its center, and looked out at the assembled galaxy. The chamber could hold representatives of thousands of species, and it was full, and every single being in it was staring at the small gray-haired human who stood where their greatest leaders had stood. And the silence was so complete that you could hear the hum of the station's ancient engines. Fell did not shout, did not raise his voice, did not pound the podium or make grand gestures. He simply spoke, and the translation systems carried his words to every ear and every mind and every corner of the vast chamber. 60 years ago, you looked at us and saw animals. You caged us, muzzled us, and told yourselves it was for the greater good. And we accepted it because we believed in the promise of this place. Patient and peaceful and good, you would eventually see us for what we are. He paused, and the silence grew deeper. We gave you 60 years of patience, 60 years of compliance, 60 years of swallowing our pride and biting our tongues, and teaching our children that the galaxy would one day accept them. And in return, you took our worlds, you took our freedom, you took our dignity. And when we finally said no, when we finally asked you to treat us as equals, you burned our children and called it peacekeeping. His voice did not waver, did not crack, did not rise. It remained level and calm, and that calmness was more devastating than any shout could have been. 17 million people died on New Thessaly. I want you to understand that number. I want you to sit with it. I want you to feel the weight of it. Because those were not soldiers. Those were not combatants. Those were mothers and fathers and children and teachers and doctors and dreamers are gone because you decided that our obedience was not enough and our defiance could not be tolerated. He looked across the chamber, meeting eyes that looked away and eyes that did not. We did not come here to destroy you. If we wanted extinction, your worlds would already be silent, and every single one of you knows it. You have seen what we built. You have seen what we are capable of, and you know that the only reason your cities still stand and your children still breathe is because we made a choice. He leaned forward slightly, and his next words were spoken so quietly that the translation systems had to amplify them, and somehow that made them louder than thunder. The containment accords are dead. The tier system is dead. And the idea that any species in this galaxy has the right to cage another is dead. From this day forward, humanity will not ask for a seat at this table. We will not beg for your approval. We will not submit to your inspections or your restrictions or your fear. We will build our own table. And here is the part that should terrify you. Here is the part that should keep you awake at night and make you question everything you think you know about us. He straightened and his voice filled the chamber, like light filling a dark room. You are welcome to join it, as equals, all of you, every species in this chamber. Even the ones who voted against us, even the ones who cheered when our cities burned, because that is the difference between us and you. You had power, and you used it to cage and kill, and we have power, and we choose to use it to build something better. And if you cannot understand that, if that concept is too alien for your ancient and sophisticated minds to grasp, then perhaps it is not humanity that is the primitive species in this room. The silence that followed was the loudest sound the Accord Spire had ever held. Then Fel turned and nodded to Admiral Achilles, and Achilles stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried the authority of 12,000 warships. Warlord Gorath Vel of the Drithaki hegemony has been captured and will face a joint tribunal for the massacre of New Thessaly. He will not be executed, because we do not believe in answering death with death, but he will be sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life on New Thessaly, rebuilding what he destroyed, stone by stone, name by name, memorial by memorial, and he will learn the name of every single person he killed, all 17 million of them, and he will carry those names until the day he dies. A murmur rippled through the chamber, not of protest, but of something deeper, something that might have been awe. In the far corner of the chamber, Counselor Faven Rose stood with tears running down his long silver face. And when Felt's eyes found him across the vast room, the human nodded once, a small gesture, a recognition of the one voice that had tried to prevent all of this, the one person who had seen humanity clearly when everyone else had looked away. After the session, Faven approached Fel in the corridor outside the chamber, his steps unsteady and his voice thick with emotion. "You could have destroyed them all," he said. "You had every right, and no one in this galaxy would have blamed you." Fel looked at the old diplomat with tired eyes that held no triumph, only the heavy understanding of a man who had carried 17 million names in his heart for 6 weeks, and would carry them for the rest of his life. "That is exactly why we didn't," he said. Faven stared at him for a long moment, and then lowered his head. "I would like to help you build what comes next," he said, "if you will have me." Fel extended his hand, a human gesture that Faven had learned decades ago, and the Valaxi took it with his four-fingered grip and held it tightly. "We would be honored," Fel said. "Saw us when no one else would. That makes you family." And standing there in the corridor of the Accord Spire, with the weight of a changed galaxy pressing down on both of them, a human and an alien shook hands, and it was not a gesture between species, but between friends, and that small quiet moment held more power than every warship in the sky. 10 years had passed since the War of Reckoning, and the galaxy was learning to breathe again. It was not the same galaxy. It could never be the same galaxy. But it was, in ways that surprised even the most cynical observers, becoming something better than what it had been before. And the reason for that was as simple as it was extraordinary. Humanity had kept its promise. When Dominic Fell had stood at the podium of the Accord Spire and told 4,000 civilizations that humanity would build a new table and invite everyone to sit at it as equals, most of the galaxy had assumed it was a beautiful lie, the kind of thing conquerors say before they reveal the chains, because that was how power had always worked in the galaxy, and no one had any reason to believe that humans would be different. But they were different, and that difference changed everything. The Galactic Cooperative was founded 9 months after the war, built on a charter that was written in plain language and fit on a single page, because Fel had insisted that any law too complicated for a child to understand was a law designed to be broken. The rules were simple. Every member species was equal, regardless of size or strength or history. Decisions were made by consensus rather than majority vote, so that no small voice could be drowned out by a loud one. Military force could only be used in collective defense, and never for expansion or punishment. And any species was free to leave at any time, for any reason, without consequence. Over 2,600 species joined in the first decade, drawn not by fear of human power, but by the startling realization that the cooperative actually worked the way it claimed to work. Disputes were resolved fairly, trade flowed freely, resources were shared based on need rather than leverage, and for the first time in galactic history, a small species with 2 colony worlds had exactly the same voice as a vast empire. With 2,000. Even former enemies came to the table. The Krev Collective, whose swarm fleets had been shattered in the 6-hour storm, were among the first to join after their new queen, a young and pragmatic leader who had inherited a broken nation, sent a message to Earth that said simply, "We were tools of the Council's arrogance, and we paid the price for it. Teach us a better way, and we will walk it." The Shovari Dominion followed a year later, their crystalline ambassadors standing in the cooperative's new assembly hall and formally apologizing for their role in the siege of New Thessaly. An apology that was accepted without conditions and without demands, because that was how the cooperative worked. Even some Drythaki joined, the younger generation who had grown up in the shadow of their empire's shame and wanted no part of it. They came quietly, individually, with their heads high and their intentions honest, and they were welcomed the same as everyone else. The Furies, humanity's 7 tactical war intelligences, the systems that had terrorized the galaxy's militaries, were repurposed. And this was perhaps the most unexpected transformation of all. Nemesis, who had dismantled the Drythaki fleet in 47 minutes, now managed disaster relief logistics across 300 star systems, coordinating rescue efforts with the same precision she had once used to coordinate kill zones. And species that had trembled at her name now sent requests for her assistance when earthquakes struck their worlds or plagues swept their colonies. Electo, who had turned the Krev swarm fleets into scrap metal, now served as a neutral arbitrator in trade disputes, her calculations so fair and so transparent that even the most suspicious species trusted her findings. The other Furies found similar roles: terraforming coordinators, medical research assistants, infrastructure planners, and the galaxy slowly came to understand that these intelligences were not weapons wearing new masks. They were tools that had been forced into a role they were never designed for, and were now, at last, being allowed to do what they were actually built for. They were built to solve problems, and war had simply been the most urgent problem at the time. And then there was New Thessaly. The planet that had been scarred by fire and loss was alive again. Not the same as before, it could never be the same as before, but alive in a way that honored what had been lost, rather than trying to erase it. At the center of the rebuilt capital, where the city of Elysium Bay had once stood, there was now a vast memorial park. Acres of green grass and quiet water surrounding walls of polished black obsidian that stretched to the horizon. And on those walls, carved in letters small enough that you had to stand close to read them, were 17 million names. Every name, every single one, each one placed with care and attention, each one representing a life that had been lived and loved and lost. And people came from across the galaxy to walk along those walls and read those names and understand the weight of what had been done here. And Warlord Gorath Vel was there too. He had been sentenced to spend his life rebuilding what he had destroyed, and he had, and the work had changed him in ways that no prison ever could have. He had started as a monster and become something more complicated. A broken creature who had been forced to stare at the face of his own cruelty every single day until it had hollowed him out and filled him back up with something he had never felt before. He did not speak about it. He simply worked, laying stones and planting trees and reading names from a list that he kept in his pocket. And sometimes visitors would see him standing alone before a section of the wall, with his massive hand pressed against the obsidian and his head bowed. Disturbed him, because whatever was happening in those moments was between him and the dead. Around the memorial, new cities rose, bright and clean and full of life, and for the first time in New Thessaly's history, aliens lived alongside humans on its surface. Valaxi and Krev and Shovari and dozens of other species who had come to help rebuild, and had stayed because they found something here that they could not find anywhere else. They found a place where the past was not forgotten, but was not allowed to poison the future. A place where the deepest wound in the galaxy had been turned into the strongest bridge. Admiral Rena Achilles had retired 3 years after the war, quietly and without ceremony, because she had never wanted to be a symbol and had no interest in becoming one. And she lived now in a small house on the coast of New Thessaly, near the memorial, where she could hear the ocean and watch the twin moons rise the way the colonists had watched them before the fire came. She was visited one afternoon by a young Drythaki, barely an adult by his species standards, who had traveled a long way to find her. And when she opened her door, he stood on her porch with his large frame hunched slightly and his yellow eyes uncertain. "I am Kale Vel," he said, and the name hung in the air between them like a held breath. "Gorath Vel is my grandfather." Achilles looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "I just made tea." He sat at her kitchen table, this grandson of the monster who had burned the world she now called home, and he told her that he had come to study human military ethics at the new university that had been built near the memorial, because he wanted to understand how a species that had been given every reason to become destroyers had chosen instead to become builders. She listened, and she nodded, and she poured him tea. For hours as the sun moved across the sky, and the shadows grew long, and when he left, she stood on her porch and watched him walk down the path toward the road, and she thought about how strange and wonderful it was that the universe could take something as broken as war and grow something as fragile and precious as this from its ashes. The cooperative held its first decennial summit on the anniversary of the war's end, a gathering of thousands of species in a new assembly hall built on neutral ground. And the final presentation was given by a young Krev historian, an insectoid woman with iridescent wings and quick, clever eyes, who had spent 5 years studying the war and its aftermath. She stood before the assembly and delivered her conclusion, and her voice was steady, and her words were simple, and they carried across the hall like seeds on the wind. Every species in this galaxy built weapons when they reached the stars. Every species learned to conquer, to dominate, to destroy. It is what we do. It is what we have always done. It is written in our genes and our histories and our oldest stories, and we have always believed that this is what strength looks like. She paused and looked out at the thousands of faces watching her. But we were wrong, because only one species, after being caged and burned and broken, after losing 17 million of its people to fire and cruelty and indifference, looked at the ashes of its dead and chose to build something better instead of something worse. And that is why they lead us now, not because they are the strongest, though they are, and not because they are the most advanced, though they may be, but because when they had every right to become monsters, when the universe itself seemed to be begging them to unleash their darkest nature, they looked into the abyss, and they said no. The hall was silent, and in that silence, something settled over the gathered species like light. After a long darkness, they said no, she repeated, softer now, and then they held out their hand, and that made all the difference. The summit ended, and the delegates returned to their worlds, carrying with them the memory of those words, and the quiet understanding that the galaxy had changed not because a powerful species had conquered it, but because a wounded species had chosen to heal it. And far away, on a quiet hill on New Thessaly, the wind carried the sound of children laughing across a field that had once been fire. Human children, and Valaxi children, and Krev children, and Drythaki children, running together through the tall grass, with the twin moons rising above them, and the stars coming out one by one in the darkening sky. An old woman sat on a bench at the edge of the field, and watched them play, and the last light of the day caught the silver in her hair, and the peace in her eyes, and she smiled, because this, not the fleet, not the fury, not the fire, this was the answer. This had always been the answer. And the stars above burned on, ancient and patient, and no longer indifferent, because someone had finally given them something worth shining for.